fellow members of the esoteric order of gamers. Today we're going to do a very short video tutorial on how to paint the figures from BattleLore 2nd edition. Now, my object in painting these figures is to paint them as quickly as humanly possible. I really don't want to muck around doing high detailed figures. I've painted the whole set of BattleLore 1st edition and all the expansions. I've painted Battles of Westeros figures and several expansions. I just don't want to muck around. I want to get these on the table and play with them as fast as possible. And also, the figures aren't highly detailed, so really it's a bit of a waste of time going to huge amounts of trouble. Hold on to your hats, let's get this done. Okay, so first I'm going to go through some basic setup. This is how I set up my painting area. First, I have over here an iPad. Now I use this for checking online if I want to check for various colour schemes. I also use it for playing audio books. So while I'm painting, I listen to audio books. Next thing I have here are my paint racks. I got these from an Australian company. I'll put the link down in the below the video. And they're great, acrylic racks, and this is where I keep all my paints and my inks. Everything organised. I've got it in rough order of hue, so I can go for something quickly. A good light, good flexible light. I've got a jar which I keep my water in. That goes there. I have a piece of folded paper towel that I can wipe my brushes on. These are my brushes. These are the three that I use for the actual painting. They're Winsor & Newton Finest Sable Series 7 watercolour brushes. Fantastic brushes, more expensive but definitely worth getting. Now for general painting, for laying on of rough base coats, and also for getting the paint from the pot, because a quick way to ruin your very nice expensive brushes is to keep dipping them in a pot all the time. So I use an old brush to get the paint from the pot onto my palette and then use my nice brush to do the painting. My palette, I have here two ceramic tiles. I put one down like that and one down like that. The reason is for some reason these surfaces here get a bit damp and they can spoil what's underneath, so I put it like that. These are fantastic. I've used this for ages and ages and ages. You can easily clean them, give them a soak in detergent, rub them with steel wool and all the paint comes off, and they're the perfect nice glossy surface for keeping paints. Underneath everything I have a piece of wood. Just a bit of cheap board, and that protects the table underneath, which is very important. In fact, I have a piece of material underneath that board further protecting the table. Very important because you can ruin tables with paints and aerosol and glues and super glues and things like that. The other thing I have is this loop. I've shown you this before. You stick this on your head and it gives you a lot of magnification, so you can see the detail on figures very closely. Particularly good for me because I'm a bit older and my eyes are going down the tubes, unfortunately. Right, we're ready to paint. Okay, now the first thing you have to do before you do any painting is prepare your miniatures. Now, I've been through the preparation of miniatures in other videos, so go back and look at my older videos and you'll get far more detail on this phase. But basically, I take each miniature and getting a craft knife, I shave off any flash. That's little bits of mould lines or bits of plastic that are sticking out on the figures. I did it very roughly with these figures. Do not bother agonising over it if you're doing a rough job. I did it very quickly, making sure not to cut my fingers off, of course, very quickly, and it was done. Then I washed them in a bowl with a little bit of detergent and gave them a bit of a scrub with a toothbrush, and that gets the residue of the plastic left over from the casting process. And so the paint will stick more easily to your miniatures. Once that was done, I stuck them to a pizza box like this with a bit of blue tack on the base. Stick them on, take it outside, until I spray all the white primer on it. Then I have all my figures, I take them off my box, and I'm ready to paint them. Now, in a previous video, I showed you how I would stick these on a strip of foam core so I could hold them all at the same time and go paint. Now, that's a very good thing to do when you're doing batch miniatures, and it makes it a bit easier to hold them and paint them quickly. But I'm not going to bother to do it this time because it's just another step and it takes more time. And I don't want to take up time, I want to get this done quickly. So I've got all the individual miniatures. One thing I have done, however, and this is just a little psychological trick to get you painting, I've done these in batches. Now, it would probably be faster for me to go through and clean them all, wash them all, prime them all in one batch. It probably would be faster, but it can be very discouraging looking at all these miniatures in their unprimed state and have to cut all this stuff off and prime them and everything. It's a pain in the neck. So what I'm doing is actually doing them in batches, because I finish a whole batch, in this case all the fat, gluttonous, obese creatures, doing all these in one go, get them painted, finished, spray varnish them, put them aside, and I feel like I've achieved something and I can get on to the next phase. So, let's finish these fat guys. Right, the first thing I'm going to do is put a base coat on these figures, and because they're mostly flesh all over, I'm using a flesh colour and just giving them all a big base coat. And I'm using one of my older brushes to do this because it's going to be very rough. And just remember, when you use your paint, put it on your palette and then add some water, thin it down a little bit till you've got a sort of milky consistency. You really need to use it straight from the pot. And quickly paint on the flesh. Right, you might want to get 2 batches going at once, because while this batch dries we can get on to another batch. Right, the next step is to paint the dark areas of armour plating, the spikes, the base, the loincloth, all the other bits. And I'll do that with a little bit more care, so I'm not going outside the shapes. Okay, I've put on all the base colours for these little fat guys. You can see, very basic. And now the magic trick, which is the wash phase. And we'll put lots of shading into all the recesses, especially all these layers of fat. Yeah. And for this I'm using Strong Tone ink by Army Painter. Squirt some out. Get a nice big brush, add a bit of water, thin it down a bit, and liberally apply. Now, when you've done that, you might want to remove a little bit of the extra, especially on highlight areas, and just wipe your brush off, get any excess off, and then just wipe it over the areas where you don't want the ink. You can also thin out the ink in areas by just soaking up a bit of it with the brush. And that way you can control how much goes into the recessed areas. Now I've added a little bit of red to that brown ink just to make it a little bit more flesh tony. Right, the next thing to do for this ugly little guy, now this is dry, is dry brush all these areas. I'm doing that in a sort of stone effect, so I get a little bit of the dark brown that I used and a bit of Deneb stone and wipe most of it off. And then just dry brush roughly those textured areas all over the mace, which I'm saying is the same material. Don't leave too much paint on the brush, otherwise this won't work. Now I'm going to go back with that colour and do little detailed spots like this, and then mix a bit of white with it and highlight these areas as well. Now at any stage you might think, well, this looks good enough for the game, this will do. I mean, this looks fine, really. Okay, here's where I'm up to with these creatures, which are called obscene, apparently. Very aptly named. Now I've done a bit of rough highlighting here, and I've just dry brushed over this bony area on these spots and put some little dabs of highlights on those spots. And then I've done a very rough highlight, and just doing on the bits where you imagine the light would be hitting if it was coming down from above, just to accentuate those rolls of fat. Very light dots of white on the knuckles. That always brings out the knuckles, I find. And you might do that on knees and toes and things as well. Tip of the nose, cheeks, little dabs of white for the eyes, and just a rough little dry brush of white across the teeth. I've got a bone colour on this thing and then highlighted with white. Some little dots for showing the rope here. And I've put red here and highlighted it with a lighter shade of red mixed with a bit of white. And as you can see, it's pretty rough. You know, up close it looks pretty rough, but from a distance on a table, it'll look great. And that's really all you need to do. Now, with this guy, they have tattoos as well. So I'll have a little experiment, see if I can get some kind of rough red tattoos on the body as well. This is probably a little bit more fleshy coloured than I wanted. Probably a bit redder, yellowy would have been good, but who cares? It looks great. Something else I wanted to do for these figures is to speed up the basing, because that can take a bit of time. If you look at my other basing tutorial, you see I'd normally put PVA glue on here, then put on some sand, then let that dry, then paint that, then dry brush it, blah, blah, blah. Now I want to do something a bit faster this time, so I've experimented for the first time using Citadel textured paints. And this is a kind of paint that has a gritty texture in it. It's thick and it has a sandy, gritty texture in it. So I painted this directly onto the base and obviously use an old brush for that. And it gave me this gritty texture, and it also has this dark green colour to start with. So I didn't even have to paint it, which is fantastic. All I did was dry brush it. I dry brushed it heavily with some goblin green. I think this is called something else. These are old Citadel paints. These have different names, but you get the rough idea. Goblin green. Then I dry brushed it with scorpion green, this very light, bright green. And then finally a pretty heavy dry brush with sunburst yellow to give it the yellow. Now if I put it down on the board, you can see it looks pretty good. Now this obviously isn't one of the figures from the game. I was using this just to experiment with the base. This is a figure that's missing some arms. But I'm really pleased with that effect. So what I'm going to do is paint the rest of my bases using that textured paint and use that technique, and I'll save a lot of time. Here's what is probably the easiest figure to paint in the set. It's the rock golems. You can see I've already based this one. And all I did with this one was paint it all over a very dark grey and then dry brush it, a shade of lighter grey, and then eventually a bit of white. So with dry brushing, I put paint on there and I wipe most of it off on a paper towel. Just brush it lightly over the surface. You've seen dry brushing done a million times, I'm sure, and the paint just adheres to the highest surfaces of the figure. And if you do it in a few layers, you build up a bit of depth of colour. And you can see I've just got highlights of white on top of the head, top of these top areas. So again, imagining that the light is coming down from above. Then put a dark blue around the little gem, and then a lighter blue, and then a little bit of squiggle of white on the top. And that's it. This looks fine to me. It looks like a golem made of rock, and it is a rock golem. And as a final step, I've just gone around the edge with a darkish green, and that just finishes it off nicely. That figure's finished now. I just give it a blast of spray varnish, clear spray varnish, and that will protect the figure. I use a semi-gloss varnish. You can use gloss or matte or semi-gloss, whichever you prefer. Just one final touch. I've done something I don't normally do, and that's paint the bases of the figures. Painted that in the green, and I'll give that a good coat of the varnish as well, just because these are going on a printed board, so I don't want unvarnished bits of paint on there. And it looks nice and neat. Right, these cavalry are a little bit of a pain. As you can see, there's a lot of detail. What I've done is put down the base colours on one figure just to get the colour scheme right, and then I'll continue through the rest of the figures. So I've given him a grey shirt just to break up the blue a bit, the rest is blue, and left these outlines white because I'll be putting gold onto those little outlines. It's a bit fiddly, but just do it carefully and it doesn't take too long. The first thing I did was paint all the horses, like so. And I've used 3 different shades for the horses to put in a bit of variety. You can see they've got black socks here, which is just a bit of black, very roughly blended in with the mid colour, so it blends in okay. You can see there on the base as well. Again, you don't have to go to this level of detail. This didn't take long though, it was very quick. And painted the manes and tails, and all the horse bodies are done. And then I'll do the rest of the figures like this, and all the base coats will be down. Here's all the base colours of the cavalry figure done. Now, I won't lie to you, these figures are a pain in the neck to paint. There's a lot of detail, and I'm painting them to match the illustrations in the game, and that's making it particularly difficult because in the illustrations all these armor plates are blue with a gold trim. So this is really the over-the-top way of painting these. If you can't be bothered, I'd suggest just painting those armor plates in an armor color and be done with it. But as I started painting this, I got more involved and I've painted those with a gold trim, and I've also got the cloak as a blue with a yellow trim, all the little detail up here. This is pretty fiddly and was a bit of a pain in the neck, but now it's done. The next thing I did was give these a bit of a wash with a light brown ink, and I end up with something that looks like this. Again, this could be left at this stage, but I'll just give this a little bit of highlighting, especially on the cloak and a bit on the horse, just to let it bring it out a little bit more. And these cavalry figures will be finally done, and they're probably the biggest challenge of this whole set.